March 9, 1945. The Marianas Islands sit like dark stones in the Pacific as the sun sinks behind American airfields on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. Across runways carved into recently captured Japanese territory, the ritual begins. Wrenches clack, fuel lines snake, checklist calls bounce between crewmen. On this evening, 325 Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers will rise. Each one readied not for the familiar high-altitude routine, but for something altogether different. Ordered from the top of the 21st Bomber Command by Major General Curtis Lame. It is a gamble wrapped in calculation. In cavernous bomb bays, armorers push past normal limits, loading clusters upon clusters. 1,520 M69 incendiary bomblets per aircraft, each filled with napalm designed to burn at 1,800° RF. The target is neither a factory complex nor a rail yard, but the densely packed Shitamachi district of Tokyo, 12 square miles, where roughly 750,000 people live in wooden homes, stacked along alleys that thread like capillaries through the city's working-class heart. The objective is strategic, the method controversial. At 17:35 hours, a silver B-29 breaks from Guam's north field and claws into the evening sky. The sound that follows is relentless. 4 Wright R-3550 engines per aircraft, droning in overlapping waves as bomber after bomber takes off, not in tight formation, but singly, each its own spear point. These machines are stripped of most defensive guns to make room for an incendiary load approaching double the usual weight, a transformation that signals a revolution in tactics. Pathfinder aircraft will lead, laying down a burning X large enough to guide the rest from miles away. Behind them, the main force will attack from just 5,000 to 7,000 feet, far below the heights for which the aircraft was designed. The plan is to trade altitude for accuracy, complexity for speed, daylight precision for night-bound devastation. The B-29 did not arrive in the Pacific as just another bomber. It arrived as the war's most advanced flying machine. It took over 1.44 million engineering man-H hours to design and cost the US $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project's $1.9 billion. Its innovations read like a ledger of wartime ingenuity. Pressurized crew compartments, remotely controlled gun turrets, and 4 of the most powerful piston engines ever fitted to an aircraft. Manufacturing sprawled across the continent, Boeing building in Seattle, Rion and Wichita, the Glenn L. Martin Company in Omaha, Bell Aircraft Corporation in Marietta, Georgia. Each superfortress stretched 99 feet with a 141-foot wingspan, carrying up to 20,000 pounds of bombs over a combat radius of 1,600 miles, climbing to 31,150 feet, and pushing a maximum 357 mph. By March 1945, around 2,000 B-29s had reached combat units, with production surging toward a wartime total of 3,970. Boeing's Wichita plant alone was turning out 4.2 superfortresses every working day. Industrial will hammered into aluminum. High above the Pacific, that will gathered into force under the 20th Air Force, commanded personally by General Henry Hap Arnold. First based in China beginning June 1944, and then, from November 17, 1944, in the newly captured Marianas Islands, the 21st Bomber Command spread across 3 bombardment wings, the 73rd and 313th on Saipan, the 314th on Guam. Together they could assemble more than 300 B-29s for a single strike, each aircraft sustained by ground crews working without pause. Across the water, Japan's defenses bore the strain of attrition and division. By early 1945, separate Army and Navy commands ran on parallel tracks, seldom intersecting. At night, the Nakajima J-1N Gecko Moonlight, converted in haste from reconnaissance duties, stalked the sky with upward-firing twin 20mm Type 99 cannons set at a 30-degree angle and another pair angled downward. In theory, it could slash at bombers from unexpected vectors. In practice, only 479 had been built, and many were gone. The Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu Dragon Killer offered another option with a nose-mounted 37mm cannon and oblique 20mm guns, but production totaled only 1.71 since 1941. Without radar for night interceptions, pilots relied on searchlights and sharp eyes, methods that faltered against fast aircraft in darkness. On the ground, Tokyo bristled with fewer than 500 heavy anti-aircraft guns. Type 99 88mm batteries formed the high-altitude shield, while Type 98 20mm cannon guarded at close range with an effective ceiling of just 11,500 feet. Crucially, fire control radar was missing. Optical rangefinders and sound locators, tools ill-suited to nights of smoke, wind, and confusion, guided the gunners. Numbers told the rest. While the Marianas could launch hundreds of B-29s in one night, perhaps 200 operational night fighters remained available across the home islands by March 1945. Fuel shortages strangled training. New pilots flew too little to master night combat. Aviation gasoline was guarded for emergencies, leaving aircraft grounded more often than not. Curtis Lame had taken command in January 1945, inheriting a campaign that wasn't delivering decisive results. Precision raids from around 30,000 feet drifted wide under the jet ream. Winds sometimes exceeding 200 mph scattered bombs far from aim points. Engines strained in the climb, magnesium components overheating at the edge of safety. Target obscuration by cloud forced crews to depend on primitive radar on roughly 7 missions out of 10. After studying the wreckage of results and the grinding mechanical toll, Lame reached for a radical, almost counterintuitive solution. Go low, go at night, go with fire. So the order went out. Strip away all but the tail guns, replace high explosives with 7 tons of incendiaries, descend to 5,000, 9,000 feet to dodge the jet ream, ease engine loads, and sharpen accuracy. Attack after dark to sidestep the radarless Japanese night fighter force. Navigate by Lauren radio signals and flow in a continuous stream rather than tight boxes. Meteorologists forecast the rest. Clear skies and strong surface winds on March 9-10 that could carry flames from one wooden block to the next. The plan fit the target like a key fits a lock. Even the target choice itself showed the calculation at work. Intelligence pointed to neighborhoods where cottage industries, small workshops inside residential blocks, fed Japan's war machine with aircraft parts, electrical equipment, and precision instruments. Using maps from the Office of Strategic Services and pre-war Japanese planning documents, analysts ranked wards by infrastructure density and vulnerability. The northeastern arc of Tokyo, Asakusa, Honjo, Fukagawa, stood out. Working-class districts of extraordinary population density, with families layered inside wooden structures separated by narrow lanes. The same fabric that made the city hum by day could, under incendiary rain, become a vast field of tinder. On the flight line, the weapon meant to unlock that grim logic waited in steel and fuses. The M69 incendiary bomblet, hexagonal, 3 inches wide and 20 inches long, about 6 pounds, carried napalm, a gelid gasoline engineered to cling and burn where water could not defeat it. Earlier thermite and magnesium designs burned hotter on paper, but not longer in wood and paper cities. The M69's delayed action fuse and white phosphorus igniter sprayed flaming fuel up to 100 feet when the bomblet struck and rolled to its side. E-46 amable clusters, 38 bomblets each, would separate at about 2,000 feet, every M69 trailing a cotton streamer to tilt its fuse downward. At Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, tests against replica Japanese houses had shown how these bomblets didn't just start fires, they multiplied them, drawing new blazes out of each ignition point. A single B-29 could carry 40 clusters, 1,520 individual sources of flame. With 279 bombers ultimately to reach the target out of 325 launched, Operation Meeting House would seed Tokyo with roughly 424,000 incendiary bomb bullets, enough to fuse separate fires into a single, self-feeding conflagration. Dusk thickened. The first B-29 to lift off that evening belonged to Brigadier General Thomas Sarsfield Power of the 314th Bombardment Wing. Over the following hours, departures rolled out at brisk 50-second intervals from 3 island bases, each crew setting into a rhythm tuned for a 14-hour round trip that would test machines and men. Lighter gear replaced heavy, cold-weather suits. The altitudes tonight would be warmer, less punishing. Without most guns, gunners, or ammunition, the superfortresses climbed clean and efficient, saving fuel for the long arc, 1,500 balabasts northward. Near the Japanese coast, Mount Fuji's snow-capped cone would be a silent beacon to those looking for confirmation in the dark. In Tokyo, the sirens would wail around 10:30 p.m., but that lay ahead. For now, the Pacific turned from copper to black, while an armada of bombers threaded toward a single city. The plan balanced science and audacity, weather and weaponry, industrial pace and tactical nerve. It did not promise mercy. It promised effect. As midnight approached over Tokyo, the city lay under a thin veil of calm. The first air raid sirens began their mechanical wail around 10:30 p.m., a sound that most residents had learned to half ignore. Earlier raids, high altitude and scattered, had done little real harm. People stayed inside their homes, confident that any bombs would fall elsewhere. Few could imagine that this night would redraw their world in fire. Tokyo's civil defense measures reflected the limits of a nation stretched beyond its means. The capital held just 18 concrete air raid shelters, enough for 90,000 people in a city of over 4 million. Everyone else relied on bugo, makeshift trenches or simple dugouts covered with boards. Firefighting forces were almost medieval in their equipment: hand pumps, sand buckets, and water barrels. 8,000 firefighters faced what would become a sea of flame. Many were women, teenagers, or elderly volunteers drawn from neighborhood brigades. They had drilled to handle house fires, not storms of napalm. At precisely 12:08 a.m. on March 10th, the first Pathfinder B-29s appeared over Tokyo. Flying low at just 5,000 feet, their bomb bays opened to drop M47 napalm bombs, igniting the target zone in 4 quadrants that formed a flaming X visible for miles. These were the signals, the marks by which hundreds of bombers would find their aim. Within minutes, the sky above the Shitamachi district filled with the silver bellies of aircraft glinting in the moonlight, each releasing clusters of M69 bomblets that tumbled earthward, streamers fluttering behind them. From the ground, it looked as though the heavens were shedding molten rain. The first explosions were muffled like distant thunder, then multiplied without pause. Each bomblet landed, hesitated, and burst, splattering flaming napalm that rolled along rooftops and walls. In the strong surface winds, gusting between 17 and 45 miles per hour, thousands of separate fires leapt outward to meet each other. Streets became rivers of flame. Within 20 minutes, the firestorm was beyond control. Entire blocks ignited simultaneously, the heat rising until it melted glass and warped metal. At street level, air temperatures exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The inferno generated its own weather, powerful updrafts that tore roof tiles into the air and sucked oxygen from basements where people had taken shelter. The roar of the fire drowned everything. Asphalt streets bubbled and ran like black rivers. In the Sumida district, 24-year-old Yoshiko Hashimoto was at home with her 13-month-old son. Her husband, a soldier, was on duty elsewhere. Later, she would describe the moment for historians. The B-29s were dropping numerous firebombs, and it sounded like heavy rain. I was astounded to see the intensity of the air raid. I had never seen one before. When the flames reached her neighborhood, Yoshiko fled with her parents, sisters, and baby into streets packed with desperate people. Panic spread faster than the fire. Families clutched what they could carry, blankets, family registers, children, and ran in any direction that seemed open. The narrow alleys of Shitamachi became death traps. Those who fell were trampled or overcome by the heat. The elderly lagged behind and disappeared into the smoke. Entire families vanished between intersections, the air itself unbreathable. The Sumeda River offered the only apparent refuge. Thousands rushed toward it, filling the embankments as fiery debris rained down. Yoshiko's father pushed her and the baby into the water. Both survived, though her mother and sister, Etsuko, did not. Burning signboards and wooden doors were flying through the air. She remembered. Warehouses on both riverbanks were engulfed in flames. Across Tokyo, similar scenes unfolded. Canals boiled, wooden bridges caught fire, collapsing beneath crowds. At evacuation centers and schools, the heat became unbearable. At Kikukawa Elementary School, a designated shelter, only twisted metal remained among the ashes where hundreds had taken refuge. Buddhist temples, some centuries old, became pyres for those who sought sanctuary within them. Firefighters worked until they could not stand. Water mains cracked under the heat. Pumps ran dry. Most companies were surrounded or destroyed. The survivors threw themselves into canals to escape, emerging with burns that the water could not cool. The roar of the conflagration carried far into the suburbs, where people watched the horizon pulse red and believed that the entire capital was ending. Above the inferno, B-29 crews witnessed a sight that defied training or imagination. Pilots could feel the turbulence of rising air columns, even at bombing altitude. Gunners peered down through blisters in the fuselage at a city vanishing into light. Some aircraft experienced near stall conditions as thermal updrafts tossed them upward hundreds of feet. Smoke rose so high that returning crews would later claim to have seen it hundreds of miles out to sea. By 2:30 a.m., the raid was largely complete. The bombers, now lighter, turned south toward the Marianas, leaving Tokyo behind them. Below, the fires merged into a single rolling front, 15 square miles of destruction feeding on its own heat. Winds from the burning city drew in air from the surrounding countryside, creating a monstrous vortex that devoured anything still standing. Morning would bring silence and ash. But before dawn, the Shitamachi district was gone. Its streets erased, its families scattered, its landmarks unrecognizable. The greatest single air raid in history had achieved its purpose with terrible precision. When daylight broke over Tokyo on March 10th, the scale of destruction stunned even those who had endured years of war. The eastern wards, Asakusa, Honjo, Fukagawa, were unrecognizable. Where entire neighborhoods had stood, only scorched earth remained. The blackened skeletons of bridges stretched across canals filled with debris. Survivors wandered silently through smoke and cinders, searching for family members among ruins too hot to touch. The numbers that emerged over the following days read like the death certificate of a city. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey estimated 87,893 dead. Tokyo's Metropolitan Police recorded slightly fewer. The fire department listed nearly 100,000 killed and 125,000 wounded. Historians would later settle on over 100,000 fatalities, more than the immediate deaths at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Nearly 270,000 buildings were destroyed across 15 square miles, displacing more than 1 million people. The city's civil structure collapsed. Hospitals were gone. Police stations and government offices had burned with their records. Schools, temples, and shrines that had survived the 1923 earthquake were erased overnight. Morgues overflowed. Cremation grounds burned continuously for weeks. Many bodies could never be identified, reduced to fragments gathered into communal graves. Firefighters who survived the night returned to ruins of their stations. The Tokyo Fire Department's 286 engines, mostly hand-operated, were useless against a firestorm of that magnitude. Water pressure across the city was gone, and hydrants spewed steam. The department's procedures, designed for isolated fires, had disintegrated within minutes of the first bomb. Entire companies vanished where they stood. Their equipment fused into the street. The psychological shock reverberated far beyond Tokyo. Survivors fled to rural areas carrying stories that contradicted the optimistic tone of official broadcasts. Rumors spread of new American weapons, of invisible gases, of unstoppable fire. Factories across Japan saw workers fail to report for duty. Morale plummeted. For many civilians, the illusion of protection, the idea that the emperor's city was invulnerable, died that night. American losses were minimal in contrast. 14 B-29s failed to return. 96 airmen were listed as killed or missing. Several bombers were lost to turbulence created by the fires themselves. Thermal updrafts so violent that aircraft simply broke apart in the air. Others fell to anti-aircraft bursts or mechanical failure, but none to Japanese fighters. The low altitude and darkness had worked precisely as General Lame intended. For those in the air, victory brought unease. Crewmen described the mission's end in subdued tones. "We could see the glow from hundreds of miles away," one recalled. "It looked like the sun rising where it shouldn't be." The bombers landed at Guam and Saipan to silence rather than celebration. Even hardened veterans found the spectacle difficult to reconcile with the concept of a military target. General Curtis Lame, standing on the tarmac in the aftermath, was blunt about his moral calculus. "I suppose if I had lost the war," he said later, "I would have been tried as a war criminal." His superior, General Arnold, was less reflective. "This shows your crews have the guts for anything," he cabled in congratulations. Between those two sentences lay the uneasy truth of modern war, where industrial logic and moral consequence diverged. The Tokyo raid reshaped strategy immediately. Within 10 days, similar incendiary attacks struck Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe, leveling Japan's other major industrial cities. The campaign paused only because stocks of M69 bomblets were exhausted. Production was increased at once. American factories redirected resources to feed what was now considered the most effective bombing method of the war. Behind the statistics, the contrast between nations had reached its sharpest edge. The United States produced 50,000 tons of incendiary bombs every month by mid-1945. Japan, its factories destroyed and its transport paralyzed, struggled even to supply bullets. The entire B-29 program had cost more than Japan's annual military budget. The American advantage in industrial capacity, 10-1, translated into absolute dominance in the air. What set the campaign apart was its scientific precision. The Chemical Warfare Service had built replica Japanese neighborhoods in Utah's Dugway Proving Ground, testing which incendiary compositions would consume a wooden house most completely. Standard Oil's laboratories refined napalm for maximum adhesion. Harvard and the University of Chicago analyzed fire propagation through simulated city blocks. Every variable, wind, humidity, construction material, was studied. The result was not chaos, but calculation. Japan, by contrast, approached air defense with outdated romanticism. Military doctrine exalted courage and sacrifice over material innovation. Leadership divisions between the Army and Navy crippled coordination. After an earlier February 25th raid that destroyed 28,000 buildings, proposals to widen streets and create fire breaks were ignored. Evacuation plans remained paper exercises. When Operation Meeting House came, the system collapsed under its own complacency. Those who survived faced a changed landscape and a changed identity. Working-class communities that had sustained Tokyo's cottage industries were gone. Small workshops producing aircraft components, electrical fittings, and mechanical instruments, half of the city's manufacturing base, had vanished with their skilled craftsmen. Supply chains disintegrated. Even factories untouched by fire found their output crippled by the loss of workers and tools. The morning after the raid revealed not merely physical destruction, but the end of a social order. Streets that had existed for centuries were erased from memory. Neighborhood networks that had bound families for generations were broken beyond repair. The city had not just burned, it had been unmade. The devastation of Tokyo signaled more than the loss of a city. It marked the unraveling of Japan's capacity to fight a modern war. In the months that followed, the fires that began in Shitamachi swept across the home islands. By August 1945, 66 Japanese cities had been struck by major incendiary raids, each reduced to the same grim pattern of ash, heat, and displacement. The destruction that many assumed would require atomic power had already been achieved by fire and gasoline. The Japanese defense system, exposed so completely during the Tokyo raid, continued to falter. Night fighter units struggled to launch even token sorties. Pilots who had survived months of attrition lacked radar, and their remaining aircraft were starved of fuel. Some, like Lieutenant Sachio Endo, achieved remarkable individual success. 8 B-29 kills. But they were rare exceptions. Most flyers never found their targets in the smoke and dark, and those who did found their guns too light for the task. The B-29's aluminum hull could absorb repeated hits from 20mm cannon without failing. A few pilots resorted to ramming attacks, destroying both themselves and their targets in desperate acts of devotion. On the ground, Japan's cities relied on an increasingly hopeless firefighting effort. The Tokyo Fire Department's ordeal became a warning to others, but resources were scarce. Manual pumps and limited water pressure meant that entire brigades were consumed by the very fires they tried to fight. Even when the flames could be reached, napalm clung stubbornly to every surface, reigniting seconds after being extinguished. Civil defense, once preached as a patriotic duty, became an act of survival with no illusions. Civilians felt the strain most acutely. Food shortages deepened, transportation faltered, and the flow of refugees from destroyed cities overwhelmed rural areas. In the wake of each raid, workers left their jobs to search for relatives or rebuild homes. Factory attendance plummeted, slowing production further. The Japanese government struggled to maintain order and faith in the war's purpose, as citizens realized the homeland was defenseless. For American planners, Operation Meeting House had proven the devastating potential of scientific warfare. Every variable, from weather to bomb composition, had been quantified and optimized. Meteorologists now guided strategy, selecting targets according to humidity, temperature, and wind conditions. The March 9-10 raid had been timed deliberately for a period of low moisture, followed by strong winds, ensuring maximum spread. Those same techniques would shape every subsequent mission. The lessons learned reached beyond tactics. Strategic analysts concluded that continued incendiary bombing could destroy Japan's industrial capability by October 1945, rendering invasion unnecessary. General Lame himself argued that firebombing alone might compel surrender. These assessments fed directly into the planning for Operation Downfall, the projected invasion of Japan, and informed the grim calculations later made by President Truman and his advisors. By summer, the campaign had become methodical. Once incendiary supplies were replenished, B-29s returned to the skies with refined techniques and heavier loads. By May, leaflet operations began. Psychological warfare in print, warning civilians which cities would be next. The leaflets carried an implicit promise of destruction that the Japanese population had learned to believe. When the bombers appeared days later, many had already fled, though few found safety. Japanese military leadership remained divided even as their cities burned. Communication failures, bureaucratic rigidity, and the belief in spiritual endurance over material advantage left defenses paralyzed. Anti-aircraft batteries continued to fire into the smoke with little effect. Fire brigades received no coordination from military units, and even messages of warning often arrived after raids had begun. International law offered little guidance for what the world was witnessing. The 1907 Hague Convention forbade the bombardment of undefended cities, yet what constituted a defended city in 1945 was open to interpretation. Every major Japanese city possessed military targets, and thus the raids were justified under the doctrine of military necessity. Post-war tribunals would try Axis leaders for the deliberate targeting of civilians, but no Allied commander would stand trial for the same. The precedent, that overwhelming force could be excused by strategic purpose, became a cornerstone of modern air warfare. As Japan's air defenses crumbled, the United States refined its strategy into a demonstration of total dominance. The contrast was stark: America's ability to replace aircraft and bombs within weeks against Japan's inability to replace its pilots or its cities. Each mission that followed Meeting House reinforced the inevitability of defeat. The firebombing of Tokyo had revealed the future of war. It was not a clash of armies, but of systems, industrial, scientific, and psychological. Where earlier generations had fought for territory, this was a battle for endurance between nations that built machines faster than their enemies could rebuild homes. And as the B-29s continued their runs over Japan, it became clear that victory would belong not to the bravest, but to the best supplied. By the time the fires of Tokyo cooled, the nature of war had changed forever. The raid of March 9–10, 1945, had revealed that modern conflict could erase cities as easily as it destroyed armies. Yet in the aftermath, the world's attention soon shifted. 5 months later, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would eclipse even this devastation, casting the Tokyo firestorm into the margins of public memory. But for those who survived, and for those who planned it, Operation Meeting House remained a haunting benchmark of what total war could become. The contrast between the B-29 Superfortress and the city it annihilated was almost allegorical. High above, the product of 1.4 million hours of engineering, pressurized and automated, carrying radar and remote-controlled turrets. Below, a metropolis of wood and paper, defended by volunteers with buckets and bamboo poles. Industrial civilization had turned its full weight upon pre-industrial humanity. The result was not battle, it was transformation. When dawn rose over Tokyo on March 10th, what had once been the capital's eastern half was a terrain of ash and silence. Recovery crews entered cautiously, their vehicles sinking into melted pavement. The air smelled of smoke and iron. In the ruins of Kikukawa Elementary School, investigators found only nails, belt buckles, and the twisted frames of bicycles where hundreds had sought shelter. Waterways were choked with debris and bodies. Across the city, people searched for landmarks that no longer existed. In the following weeks, workers and soldiers cleared the wreckage in teams. Many victims were buried in mass graves without identification. Medical services were overwhelmed. Hospitals outside the burned area struggled to treat tens of thousands of patients suffering burns and respiratory damage. The survivors, mostly women, children, and the elderly, wandered the ruins in dazed silence. The fire had not just taken their homes, it had erased their neighborhoods, the unbroken lines of community that had defined urban life for centuries. The loss extended far beyond human life. The Shitamachi district had been Tokyo's industrial heart. Small workshops, often attached to family dwellings, produced vital components: electrical instruments, precision fittings, aircraft parts. Their destruction disrupted every supply chain that fed Japan's remaining factories. Thousands of craftsmen with irreplaceable skills were dead or displaced. In surviving facilities, productivity collapsed as workers coped with trauma and homelessness. As the American campaign resumed in May, the destruction became almost routine. Cities were announced in advance through leaflet warnings, giving civilians a false sense of choice: stay and burn, or flee and starve. The raids that followed were increasingly unopposed. Japan's night fighter units were nearly gone, ammunition was scarce. The air raid sirens became a ritual of inevitability. By the summer of 1945, Japan was no longer a country under siege, but a nation already defeated in everything except name. For many of the American air crews, the moral reckoning came later. Richard Bale of the 9th Bombardment Group described watching Tokyo's fires from his cockpit window, a vision that stayed with him for life. Others refused to speak of it at all. The men who had carried out Lame's orders understood the necessity of ending the war quickly, but necessity did not erase the memory of what they had seen. Among Japanese survivors, the trauma endured for generations. Children orphaned that night often never discovered what became of their parents. Families who survived together faced homelessness and hunger in a city without infrastructure. The historian and survivor Katsumoto Saotome would later dedicate his life to preserving the memory of the raid, founding the center of the Tokyo raids and war damage to collect testimonies from those who had lived through it. Without such efforts, their stories might have vanished with the ashes. In the post-war years, Japan rebuilt, but the firebombing remained an unhealed wound. Unlike Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which became international symbols, the destruction of Tokyo was harder to frame as martyrdom. It was too vast, too ordinary in its horror, a civilian tragedy born from strategic logic. The absence of clear memorials reflected the complexity of remembrance. How to honor the dead without condemning the victory that ended the war? For military historians, Operation Meeting House remains a case study in both efficiency and ethical peril. It demonstrated how scientific precision could magnify destruction to industrial scale, and how quickly strategy could blur into annihilation. The B-29 campaign proved that air power alone could cripple a nation's capacity to fight. Yet it also showed that terror from the sky, however absolute, did not compel immediate surrender. Japan endured for 5 more months, clinging to the hope of a negotiated peace. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's capitulation in August 1945, he spoke of a new and most cruel bomb, but the reasoning extended beyond atomic fear. The fire raids had already gutted the nation's industry, broken its cities, and shattered its morale. The emperor's decision, though couched in the language of divine resignation, was the final acknowledgement that the war had become unwinnable long before Hiroshima. The raid on Tokyo was the culmination of industrial warfare, machines built by millions of hands destroying homes built by families. It blurred the boundary between soldier and civilian, strategy and survival. In its aftermath lay a question that would follow humanity into every war since. How much destruction can be justified in the name of peace? In the end, Operation Meeting House stands not merely as a military success or a historical statistic, but as a warning. It revealed the full consequence of technology unmoored from restraint, the point where science, industry, and policy converge to produce firestorms that consume everything human within their reach. 325 aircraft launched, 279 reached the target, 1,165 tons of incendiaries dropped, 15.8 square miles burned, 267,871 buildings destroyed, over 100,000 lives lost, 1 million displaced, each number a fragment of a night when an empire of wood met an age of fire, and the world crossed the threshold into the modern era of total war.